Did you know that salary isn't the only thing you can negotiate for once you've gotten a job offer? By the end of this video, I'm going to share with you all the things you can ask for when deciding whether to take a new position. And I'll also talk about how you open up that negotiation. And stick around to the end as I'll share a story about how I was able to create some value for myself and also for my employer by following some of the advice I share here. I think it's really common for many of us when we get a job offer to think that the main thing we're supposed to negotiate, if we're negotiating anything, is the salary. So we think to ourselves, well, this is the organization's benefits package, and this is their health care, and this is the vacation, but the one thing I could work on maybe is a little bump in salary. And that simply isn't true. In fact, in many situations, especially once we're beyond an entry-level job, pretty much everything is up for negotiation. So the first thing I want to invite you to do once you have that offer is to consider both your long and your short-term non-monetary interests. So when I say non-monetary, I mean things like your quality of life, maybe things about, your retirement, about vacation, about healthcare, about title. When I say title, I mean job title, about office space, about fringe benefits, etc. So think as broadly as you possibly can and make a list of both those short-term non-monetary interests and the long-term ones. As you're thinking about this, right, think about what's important to you around vacation, around benefits, around maybe 401k or pension, or even things around professional development, mentors, the kinds of assignments that you'll get, who you'll get to work with within the organization. All of those things are negotiable. So for example, I know that some of my students who have gotten offers from law firms, before they're accepting, will think about what partners at this firm do I think of as potential mentors. And they will pre-negotiate to get to work with certain people or in certain departments. Or in some cases, I've had students of mine who wanted to do substantial pro bono work. So maybe they wanted to work on behalf of LGBTQ people, or maybe they want to work on behalf of criminal justice reform. And so as part of their negotiation, they expanded it beyond salary to make sure, for example, they might be the first ones called upon should the firm take on a pro bono case involving criminal justice reform. Having this broad set of interests then leads to the next step. And the next step is to think about, are there low-cost, high-value ways that your employer might be able to meet some of these interests? So for example, it may be the case that your employer can give you a better title that will look good on your CV and your business card at little cost to them and at high value to you. Alternately, perhaps your employer is worried that you are likely to leave the job within a year or so. And so they may be willing to, for example, give you more of a 401k benefit if you're willing to stay longer. So for example, they may say, we'll increase your benefit if you stay to year 2 or 3 than if you don't do that. Or for example, if you really want to grow professionally, you may be able to negotiate with your employer for a budget to take executive education classes on, negotiation or dispute resolution or leadership or communication. These are things that also advance the employer's interests, but can be done often at a lower cost than simply paying out that money as salary. Let me give you a real life example. Some years ago, I did some work for The Gap. As many of you know, The Gap is a clothing retailer that also owns Old Navy and Banana Republic. And it turns out that I happen to wear lots of clothes from The Gap at Banana Republic and Old Navy. And so owning some of their clothes was actually one of my interests. What had occurred to me is that it might make sense to actually take a salary reduction in exchange for a much higher amount of their clothes. And so specifically taking, let's say, a $1,000 deduction in salary to get a $2,000 gift certificate to the Gap, Banana Republic, and Old Navy. Now, how is that value creating? Well, the reality is a $2,000 gift certificate is still worth $2,000 real dollars to me, because over some period of time, I'll actually spend $2,000 at these stores. But my guess is that a $2,000 gift certificate actually costs the Gap less than $1,000. That's because their margins are so high. So let's imagine it costs them $400. That's $1,600 in value to be divided between each of us with no loss to the Gap. It's actually better for them. And so this was this example of thinking broadly about my interests and making trades that are high value to me and low cost to them. Now, as you can imagine, for the next few years, all of my friends and family only got gifts from the Gap, Banana Republic, and Old Navy. This leads to the next important piece of advice here, is that once you are framing your request, you want to do it in a way that aligns with your own employer's interests and also their self-concept, the story they tell about themselves. So to go back to that Gap example, in this case, one of their interests probably was in saving money. And so clearly this is an example where they could save money. But also their self-concept might be that we're super creative and we think out of the box. And so by making this proposal to shift salary into gift certificate in a way that allows them to say, wow, we are creative and we thought out of the box, that makes it easier for them to say yes to. Alternately, right, you can say something like, I wouldn't be worth the amount of money you're paying me if I didn't bring up these other creative ideas that I think would advance both me and frankly also you. And I hope you'll think about that. And so in some sense, you're saying your brilliance in hiring me is showing itself in my decision to negotiate around professional development, or to negotiate around flex work time, or negotiate around my title. Now, what happens if all of your creativity doesn't pay off? That is if they say no. If they say no, don't just say, oh, okay, and walk away. Instead, ask them to explain why, from their perspective, the idea doesn't work. So in other words, instead of fighting them or walking away, just say to them, say more. I'd really like to understand what I missed here or why this doesn't meet your interests. Sometimes they may say something that actually allows you to address their interests differently. So I'll give you an example. When I got promoted from being a lecturer to an assistant clinical professor at Harvard Law School, one of the things I was hoping for was to have an office that was not the size of a lecturer, but rather the size of a professor at Harvard Law School. And so when I asked my dean for the bigger office, she said, I'm afraid we can't do that. And I said, oh, I'm really disappointed, but can you help me understand what the concern is? And she said, oh, absolutely, Bob, we wish we could give you a bigger office, but space is such an issue here. We just can't do it. And I said, so just to be clear, it's around space issues, not around cost or other issues. Absolutely, there's no space. Great. What that enabled me to do, once I understood what their interest was to actually go around and identify where their space is available at the law school. And what I was able to figure out is that there were 2 small offices that were never used in the department in which I was working. And of course, there was my small office. Now, none of these offices were contiguous or next to each other. But what I thought was, if we can actually switch these office spaces around and make my office plus one of the other offices that was never used be next to each other, then we could knock the wall down and I could have the regular sized faculty office, and the remaining hardly ever used office could be a shared office that, frankly, would still be hardly ever used. And so I went back to my dean with this suggestion that we simply reshuffle where these small unused offices were so that we had my office contiguous to a hardly ever used office. We then knock the wall down and create one big office for me, leaving another hardly ever used small office to continue to be hardly ever used. Guess what? She said yes. And so the idea here, right, is even when I get a no, when I understand what the interest is, maybe it opens up a space for something that will work. The other thing here is that when I ask why, I may learn something that sounds very legitimate. When I hear that, I typically will say something like this. So let's just use the same example around the office space. I will say something like, so it sounds like the issue is space. Can I ask you that if the space situation changes, so maybe we build a new building, for example, that we can reconsider this so that I will be treated in the same way that the rest of the faculty is. So I call this negotiating for most favored nation status. That is to say that if there's a precedent or if there's some other policy that is preventing me from getting X, I'll agree to that, but I want to make sure that if that policy changes, I will then be eligible for X. So once you have that offer in hand, there are a whole bunch of ways that you can negotiate around non-monetary interests in negotiation. The steps in doing this are, first, think about both your short and long-term non-monetary interests. Things like work-at-home policy or vacation, benefits, title, office, who you're going to work with, your 401k, professional development opportunities, and make a list of those things. Second, frame that ask in ways that will align with your employer's interests and their self-concept. If they think of themselves as really creative, frame the ask as a way that they can prove that creativity. If they think of themselves as brilliant for hiring you, frame your ask as an example of their brilliance in hiring you. And lastly, if they say no, don't just drop it. Ask them to say more. Ask them why. Take that positional no and try to understand what their interests are. If you can meet their interests, maybe you'll still get what you want. And if not, then say to them, if the situation changes, can I be eligible for this thing I'm asking? So if you want to learn more on how to negotiate, watch this next video, which is how do I negotiate when the other side has more power? And of course, please like this video if you haven't already, ring the bell for notifications, and please subscribe to my channel. It'll be totally worth it. Thanks so much. Okay, click, keep watching. You want to get more power yourself.